Agreement of 1998. Our speakers today are Dr. David Mitchell, the Associate Professor of the Department of Conflict Resolution from Belfast, and Father Thomas Sladen, who is going to join us. Definitely he's on his way, and he's the coordinator on ecumenism from the Irish community of the Jesus Society. And this event is a landmark event because we claim that for a long period of time we used to have a project dealing with this healing of the traumas on the role of societies, church organizations, and we were supported by the Dutch organization Church in Action. The event we're going to hold is the final one this semester, so probably we'll continue it in the next year. But before we proceed with the main issues for our discussion, I should focus on some questions related to the nature of the conflict in the Northern Ireland, because in modern Ukraine, we know very, very little about those events. Dr. Mitchell, could you please characterize the reasons for the explosion of violence in the Northern Ireland in 1960s?
Yeah, and first I'll say thanks very much for the invitation. So I'm here in Belfast on a nice sunny day, which is unusual for us. And yeah, I teach a master's in conflict resolution here, so mostly international students who want to come and study peace and conflict in Belfast. So it's great to be here. This is my first contact with Ukraine, so it's exciting. And yeah, and people around the world are still quite interested in Northern Ireland because people think it is quite a successful peace process, and they think maybe there are lessons here. So I'm always happy to meet groups from overseas who come to Belfast to study what went on here. But it's a complicated question about what people can learn. But yeah, I'm very happy to talk about the origins of the conflict, especially in the 1960s. And of course, history is controversial. I suppose all conflicts are about history, really, what happened, but also the meaning of what happened. So the two sides here do not agree about history. They do not agree on why things happened, what caused what. Those questions are still very much alive today. Why did the conflict really start in the 1960s? Well, I suppose we have to go back into history, and we can go back very, very far. We can go back 800 years if you want, which was whenever the first invasion of from Britain of Ireland occurred by the Normans. But most people would trace the conflict to the 1600s, the early 1600s. And this is whenever something called the plantation happened. And this was really a colonial policy of the English monarchy to try and control Ireland better. And they did this by sending over thousands of British people, people who were loyal to the English monarchy. Um, and really, the reason the English monarchy wanted to do this was to secure their territory. They wanted to make Ireland part of the British state, and this would help stop possible invasion by the Spanish and the French coming in through Ireland. So this is why England wanted to control Ireland. And the really significant thing about the settlers who came over was that they were Protestant. So this happened not long after the Protestant Reformation, and the people who came were from England and Scotland, were Protestant, and they were loyal to the Protestant English monarchy, whereas the people who lived in Ireland were Catholic, Roman Catholic. And this religious difference was really quite significant. And the differences that we have today, the identity differences, really come from the plantation period in the early 1600s. And the Protestant settlers were particularly concentrated here where I am in the northeast of the island. And that really is the root of the future problems. Now, what happened then? Well, after the plantations, Ireland was part of the British state, but in the late 19th century, early 20th century, Ireland really wanted independence from Britain. But the Unionists, the Protestants in the north, who were the descendants of the settlers, they did not want to be part of a united Irish state because they thought that their religious rights as Protestants would be taken away. And they thought that a united Ireland would be dominated by the Roman Catholic Church and that they would have no rights. But there was also a big economic dimension because the North was more industrialized than the South. And the North was part of the British economy. It was closely linked to other industrialized British cities. It was part of the big British Empire, which was, very prosperous and huge at the time. And so the Northern Unionists did not want to be part of a united Ireland. So they said that they would resist Irish unity. And to make a long story short, to solve this problem, Britain created a border in Ireland. It partitioned Ireland into the north and the south. The north became Northern Ireland and it stayed in the United Kingdom, whereas the rest of Ireland became independent. Now, did this solve the problem? Well, yes and no. It did prevent a civil war at the time between the North and the South, but it created a new problem because in Northern Ireland, roughly one third of people were nationalist Roman Catholic, and they did not like being still in the United Kingdom. They wanted to be in a united Ireland. And the way Northern Ireland was run was that a regional government was set up and it was run by the Unionists. And they were fearful of this Roman Catholic minority. They thought they were disloyal. They thought they were a threat to the state. And so the Unionists treated Catholics like second-class citizens. Uh, and it was hard for Catholics to get a job. It was hard for them to get a house. And the voting system was chosen to ensure that there was always a unionist majority. There was always a unionist government. So it was really a one-party state. And this situation persisted right up until the 1960s when things began to change. In the 1960s, Catholics started to go out on civil rights marches. They wanted equal rights in Northern Ireland. They were not looking for a united Ireland. They did not want to overthrow British rule. They wanted equal rights within Northern Ireland. And they were inspired by the civil rights movement in the United States at the time. Now, the Unionist government were very worried about this, and they reacted very harshly to these protests. And they banned marches, and sometimes there was violence at marches. And this made the Catholics even more eager to get their rights. Now, at the same time, other things started to happen. So the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, which had been very small um, and not really active, it began a new rebellion, a new insurgency to try and get rid of British rule from Ireland. On the Unionist side, they formed paramilitaries. So local people created these organizations to protect their areas, but then they started to fight against the IRA. And then there was a lot of street violence. Um, Catholics were forced to leave Protestant areas, and Protestants were forced to leave Catholic areas. There were a lot of refugees, people who had to leave to go to the south or to go to England or Canada or wherever. And there was so much trouble that the British government decided that the Unionist government could not control the situation. And so in 1972, London took over direct control of Northern Ireland. And it also sent in the British Army to try and keep the peace. So the British Army came over to keep the peace, uh, and they were welcomed actually initially, but soon the British Army became part of the problem. They were drawn into the conflict, um, and they did certain terrible atrocities, such as Bloody Sunday, where they killed 13 unarmed civilians. And really, this just made the situation worse. And the IRA became more and more popular. And this situation really persisted then for the next 25 years. So it's a very complicated origin. And if you ask anybody in Northern Ireland, they might give you a different story. They might explain things differently, but I'm trying to give you an overview of what happened at that period.
Дякую. Кожне
Thanks a lot.
протистояння
So
має фази
every
свого розвитку.
opposition has got some
Доктор
phases,
Мітчелл, чи
development
могли б ви
phases. Dr.
окреслити, можливо,
Mitchell, could
якісь
you
особливості
outline
розвитку
some
саме гарячої
specific
фази цього
peculiarities
конфлікту?
in the hot phase of that conflict?
Yeah, so the nobody thought that the Troubles would last for 30 years. Everybody thought this was just a short period of unrest, a short bit of trouble, and then things would get back to normal. But one thing led to another, and really Northern Ireland entered a cycle of violence. Um, and the paramilitaries, they did not start the Troubles. The Troubles started with the civil rights, with the street violence, state violence. But then the paramilitaries used the situation to pursue their traditional ends, and really the paramilitaries then continue the conflict on. Like I said, the British state made things worse through events like Bloody Sunday, which made people very angry. They also did something which we call internment. In 1971, they arrested hundreds of people without any evidence or without any trials, and they put them in jail. Um, and this, but most of these people were innocent, and this made people in the Catholic nationalist community, especially, even angry. Or the loyalist, the Unionist paramilitaries, or what are often called loyalist paramilitaries, they deliberately attacked Catholic civilians because they thought that the IRA were supported by the Catholic community. So the loyalist paramilitaries thought if they terrorize ordinary Catholics, then they will stop supporting the IRA. Now, that didn't work, but that was another factor which created a huge amount of fear. And throughout the 70s, 80s, there were a number of attempts to end the violence through political means. So the political parties and the British government, they tried to find a new way to govern Northern Ireland, which everyone could accept, but and that would stop the violence, but they did not succeed. Um, the closest they came was in 1974 when they created a power sharing government between Unionists and Nationalists. But Unionists did not like this arrangement, and there was a general strike by Unionist workers, and that power sharing government collapsed. And then once you come into the 1980s, you have the Margaret Thatcher government, a conservative British government. And it had this plan, which was called Ulsterization, which meant that they wanted to contain the problem to Northern Ireland. And they decided to treat the paramilitaries as ordinary criminals. They did not want to treat them as political militants or political prisoners. Um, and this made Republicans, Irish Republicans, very angry in particular. And that's whenever the IRA and other groups held the hunger strike. The hunger strikes occurred in 1980, 1981. And many Republican prisoners refused to eat until they got political status. They wanted to be treated as political prisoners. But Margaret Thatcher's government did not want to do this. They wanted to treat them as criminals, and they thought that that would reduce the violence. And people may know about Bobby Sands. He was the most famous hunger striker. 10 men in total died on hunger strike. And this was a really awful time in Northern Ireland. And there was a huge amount of violence during the hunger strikes. And then there were these huge funerals. So whenever the hunger strikes died, thousands and thousands of people came to the funerals of the men, and they became these huge public demonstrations of anger. Now, throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, there is a kind of horrible pattern of tit for tat killing. So one side would kill somebody, and then the other side would seek vengeance and carry out another attack. And it really seemed to have no end in sight. Another aspect of the conflict, which we are learning about all the time, is the link between the British state and some of these paramilitaries. Because the police and the army had many informers in both the IRA and the Unionist paramilitaries. They paid many people in these groups for information. And there is evidence that in some cases, the British state gave information to some of the paramilitaries to help them carry out attacks. And in other cases, the British security forces knew that an attack was going to happen, but they did not stop it because they wanted to protect their informers. So this is a very murky, very difficult, very controversial aspect of the conflict. People call it the dirty war, which is very much hidden and something that we are learning about all the time. But really, by the time we get to the 1990s, things are very hopeless. No one really expects the conflict to come to an end because it is in this cycle of reprisal and revenge. And perhaps one reason that the conflict lasted so long was because it never became that bad. The violence reduced to a level of about 100 killings per year, 100 people killed on average per year. And society was able to function while that level of violence went on. The violence never got to the stage of somewhere like Bosnia or Rwanda. It never became as large scale as that. And perhaps that's one reason why it went on. The state really just wanted to contain the violence, but it did not really have a strategy for ending the conflict.
Дякую. Дорогі наші учасники семінару, маю дуже таку сумну новину.
Thank you, dear participants. I have a very sad piece of news. Unfortunately, Father Thomas will not be able to join us. He's got some problems with internet or with computer, but anyway, we will continue with our workshop. Dr. Mitchell, 1998, finally, the historical agreement was made under the Belfast Agreement. What was the path towards this agreement? Was the society, the public, ready to accept it? Were both sides of the conflict ready to launch this process of reconciliation?
Yeah. So it's a big question. Why did the peace process happen when people were so hopeless? Nobody expected it to happen. And historians are still studying the origins of the peace process because every year there are new archives being opened by the state. And so they're always studying the origins of the peace process. But I will try and explain why all this happened. There were a number of factors. One was that there was a stalemate in the conflict. So the IRA knew that it could not defeat the British state. The IRA knew it could continue attacking the British state, but it knew it could not defeat the British state. At the same time, the British state knew that it could not defeat the IRA finally. It knew it could keep stopping IRA attacks. And in the early 1990s, the police and the army became very successful. They were able to stop most of the IRA bombings and shootings. Um, but the British state also knew that they could never fully defeat the IRA. And so both sides realized that a political solution would be best for everybody. A second factor at the time was um, a better relationship between Britain and Ireland. So in the mid 1980s, the UK and Ireland realized that they had to work together to stop the conflict because the conflict was bad for both the UK and for Ireland. It was bad for their international reputations. It was bad for economics. It was bad for many reasons. So in 1985, London and Dublin signed the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And in this agreement, they said they would work together to find a solution that would stop the trouble, stop the conflict. And at the same time, uh, the European Union or the European Community, as it was developing. And then in the early 90s, we have the European Union, the single market, and this helped improve the relationship between the UK and Ireland because they were both members of the EU, and so it was easier for them to interact. They were both equal members of the EU, which in a sense raised the status of Ireland in comparison with the UK. And there were good relationships between the leaders of the UK and Ireland, civil servants in the UK and Ireland. And you also the Cold War ended, obviously, in the early 1990s, and this created a new atmosphere of optimism. There was progress in South Africa, in Palestine, and it seemed like an optimistic time. And I think this helped inspire some of the political leaders in Northern Ireland. And then a third factor, I think, is grassroots activity. So throughout the conflict, ordinary people had been doing peace work, peace and reconciliation work. The churches, many Christian organizations, the trade unions, women's groups, other civil society organizations had always been working to try and improve relationships. In fact, one of the most significant cases of this was uh, the the Catholic Church, because Clonard Monastery, which is a big church in West Belfast, it hosted secret talks between the IRA and John Hume, who was the leader of the moderate nationalist party. And John Hume was trying to persuade the IRA to end their violence and come up with a political strategy. And some of the priests in Clonard Monastery acted as mediators in those secret talks. And the monastery was a safe space, a neutral space, which people were able to go to and have confidential conversations in the early years of the peace process. Or another example is the Corrymeela community. Corrymeela was a faith-based organization which began in the 1960s, and it has a beautiful building on the north coast of Ireland. And it was a place that people from all backgrounds could go and meet each other and have honest conversations, grassroots people, but also political leaders. And it was an important neutral space that helped facilitate, helped feed into the peace process. Um, so those were the factors that came together in the sort of early 1990s. And really, in 1994, the IRA and the Unionist paramilitaries called ceasefires. Uh, and actually, tonight I am going to an event which is marking the 30th anniversary of the ceasefires. So we were always talking about history in Northern Ireland. So the ceasefires were hugely significant because they opened the way for political talks. The political talks began in 1996, and then they lasted for 2 years. And then the agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, was finalized in 1998. So I can tell you all about it if you want me to as well. So, um, but really, yeah, it was a hopeless situation, which then amazingly everyone was surprised that progress happened. But the progress was not inevitable either. Um, it could have collapsed. It was a very delicate dance between the paramilitaries, the politicians, the governments, the public. Um, but I think the most important factor was how Britain and Ireland worked together to try and steer the peace process to a conclusion.
Дякую. Докторе Мічел,
Thank
деякі
you.
дослідники
Dr.
говорять
Mitchell,
про
some of the
сучасну клінічну
researchers, while
задію
talking about modern
стверджують,
Northern
що
Ireland,
насильство у
claim that violence
1998 році
of
закінчилося, але
1998
справжній мир так
was
і не
terminated,
розпочався. Як ви ставитеся до
but
цієї
the
тези?
real peace has not arrived yet. What do you think about this statement?
Yes. Well, how do we judge the peace that we have today? And I suppose it depends where we compare Northern Ireland to. Um, I think compared to many other post-conflict societies, Northern Ireland is doing very well. But perhaps compared to the potential, what we could achieve, Northern Ireland could do better. I think one problem is we still have a divided society. So most people live within areas where everybody is the same as them. So if you're a Protestant, you live in a Protestant area. If you're a Catholic, you live in a Catholic area. And this is one very sad impact of the conflict, that the violence actually separated people out before in the 1960s, areas were more mixed, but the violence polarized and separated people. And now we are living with the effects of that, so that most areas are either Protestant or Catholic. Now that is changing very slowly, but it's very slow. Um, that might be linked to the Good Friday Agreement because the Good Friday Agreement created a power sharing system, and it said that unionists and nationalists have to share power in government together. Um, but it did not, the agreement did not try and integrate people. It tried to sort of keep the two tribes separate but kind of equal and forcing them to work together. And I think the politicians have not done enough to try and integrate society and promote reconciliation. The agreement also says that in the future, Northern Ireland uh, can join a united Ireland state. So the agreement said that Northern Ireland will stay in the UK, in the United Kingdom, as long as a majority of people wanted to. Um, and that worked at the time, but it does mean that Irish nationalists are still hoping to have Irish unity. So they want to have another referendum, and they want to win a referendum. They think they can win a referendum, uh, and that would mean that the North joins the South. And unionists are obviously a little bit worried about that. They don't want another referendum. And we have had Brexit, where the UK has left the European Union. And this has made things more difficult here because um, it makes it more likely that people would want a united Ireland because if they rejoin Ireland, then they can get back into the European Union. Um, and Brexit has also created a trade barrier between Britain and Northern Ireland, which has made unionists very angry because they don't want any barriers. Um, so, yeah, but having said that, everyday life for most people is much, much better. I mean, my children, they go to school and they don't know anything about the conflict, hardly anything. And they just live their lives in peace without any fear. And that is a good thing. It doesn't really impact people's lives. Um, Now, many victims of the conflict are still angry because they have not had justice, they have not had truth, they also have not had adequate health support, mental health support. Um, so I think victims have been left behind. And we also have other legacies of the conflict. So, for example, in working class areas, in poor areas, the paramilitaries are still in control, especially loyalist paramilitaries. Loyalist paramilitaries are like the mafia. They uh, do organized crime. They act like a police force in their areas, and they create misery for people. And I think that is a feeling of the peace process that we still have paramilitaries, but it is a legacy of the conflict. Um, and also the peace process has brought many positive things. So Belfast is a completely transformed city. It is a pleasant place to be. It is full of tourists. We have cruise ships coming. We have international film studios. We have high-tech industries. We have new buildings and new roads. So it is good. There are many good things that have happened. but some of the poorer areas of Belfast and Northern Ireland have not really benefited. And during the conflict, it was always the poorer areas which were impacted the most. So that is another thing that we need to do better at. We need a more equal society. And one other thing I'll mention just as I'm talking, another good thing from the peace process has been the transformation of the border, the Irish border. So during the conflict, uh, the Irish border was very militarized. There were trade checks and there were security checks. And you would cross the border and you would be in a queue, and soldiers would point guns at you and they would search your car, and there were military watchtowers. It was all very difficult. But now the border is invisible. You don't even know when you cross the border. And that is a great thing. It has improved ordinary people's lives so much. And many people now live in Northern Ireland and they work in the south, or they live in the south and they work in the north, or they live in the north and they go to school in the south. They go shopping across the border, whatever. And things are much better along the border. So yeah, many improvements, but also many things which I think need more work.
Дуже вам дякую. Дорогі колеги,
Thank you so much, dear
фантастичну
colleagues. We have a
новину.
fantastic
Отець Томас
news.
подолав всі технічні
Father Thomas
проблеми на шляху нашого
overcame
семінару.
all the
І
technical
він вже є
issues
з
to join
нами.
our
Отче Томасе, чи ви
seminar. So,
чуєте
Thomas, can
англомовний
you
переклад?
hear the English translation?
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here. My apologies that I was delayed entering. I eventually switched off my Samsung and switched it on again, and it worked the second time. Can you hear me?
Okay. Can you switch translation?
Let me see. At the moment, I was just trying to make sure I was getting translation when people were speaking in Ukrainian. So I put a.
Please choose button interpretation below.
Right. But on the left-hand side or right-hand side?
On mine, it's right.
Right. Yes. Let's see. Now, I think you can see me again now.
Yes, we can see you.
Yes, and hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. Oh,
but something wrong with your camera, Father Thomas.
Right. Let me see. I just wonder if I turn this around like this, it might work better. And
if it is problematic, we can work without camera, Father Thomas. Right. Yes, right. Colleagues.
Because I put on the camera there a few moments ago. Let me see. I haven't stopped video. As far as I'm concerned, the camera is on. I just wondered, did I obscure it when I was just changing the position? I'll just stop it for a moment now.
Father Thomas, we may talk without camera. It is not a problem for us. Yes, colleagues? What are you thinking? Yes. Okay.
Yes. Which question would you like me to address?
So,
one question you put to me was, can we speak of these troubles as the last armed interfaith confrontation in Europe? And what I would say is, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Was this the last armed interfaith confrontation in Europe? I would say it really wasn't an interfaith confrontation. It was a struggle between people around the issue of identity and sovereignty. It was between people, some of whom saw themselves as British, some of whom saw themselves as Irish, but there was a religious dimension in that most of those who saw themselves as British were actually Protestant, and most of those who saw themselves as Irish were actually Catholic. But there were many different strains or groups among them, and some wanted to bring forward their identity through peaceful means, and then some felt that the use of violence was justified. And there was much division between people on the same side, between those who favored the use of armed force and those who favored a more constitutional, a more parliamentary way. So I don't think this was actually a religious war, but it had a religious dimension. And in terms of identifying where you were, and David there was speaking about just neighborhoods being kind of distinctly kind of Catholic, Protestant, Irish, British, kind of nationalist, unionist. You could know where you were. When you were in the Catholic area, it was normally nationalist, pro-Irish. When you were in Protestant area, it was normally unionist, pro-British. But the dimension of religion gave an added extra to those who were involved in the struggle. It gave them a sense that God was on their side, that their cause had divine support, had godly backing. And that sometimes gave people kind of the freedom to maybe act in the way they wouldn't ordinarily have acted, kind of feeling God is with us, God is on our side. One would hope that true religion would make people more moderate, would make people reflective, would make them self-critical. But some forms of religion can sometimes give people a sense that they have a unique contribution to make that nobody else can make. It has to be made in this time, and physical force might be the only way to do it. I don't think we can say this is the last confrontation in Europe. I would hope that it were, but sadly, I think that confrontation on issues of identity, on issues of sovereignty, with which there will be a religious connection, will probably emerge elsewhere in the future. What I would hope is that as Europeans, whether we're in the European Union or not, we could all have a sense of responsibility for the continent and try and identify these issues and places and support peaceful and constitutional ways of discussing these issues, of bringing them forward and of resolving them. The question arose, what prevailed in the very nature of the conflict, religion and ethnicity or politics? I would say that in the conflict, it was mainly politics. Those who wanted to be part of the United Kingdom, who wanted to keep the status quo and Northern Ireland to remain kind of within the United Kingdom, and those who wanted a united Ireland, those who wanted Northern Ireland to be part of the Republic. That was the main issue. But the fact was that it was mainly Protestants who wanted to be part of the United Kingdom, but not totally. There were some Catholics also. And it was mainly Catholics who wanted to be part of the Republic, but not totally. As always in Irish life, there were exceptions, and there were some Protestants who might have aspired towards a united Ireland. Nowadays, we often talk about the communities in terms of Protestant, Unionist, Loyalist, bringing in a certain amount of religion, kind of a certain amount of just the political dimensions of maybe more moderate and maybe kind of more physical force kind of approaches the situation. And then the other community is referred to often as Catholic, kind of nationalist, Republican. So I think it would be untrue to say that there was no religious dimension. This was totally divorced from religion. There was a religious dimension, but it wasn't the primary issue. But it was a great embarrassment to the churches in Ireland, because Ireland had this long and well-respected missionary tradition of bringing the gospel to the ends of the earth. And so many Irish people had worked as missionaries in Africa, in Asia, all throughout the world. And this would be true of both Protestant and Catholic. And often it was a great embarrassment. We have brought the gospel to so many parts of the world, but there seems to be great difficulty living it here. Now, I think the churches recognize that we are part of the problem. We are part of the issue like everybody else. But the issue here wasn't mainly a religious one. It was mainly kind of a political one. But the identity, the label of those who were backing the two particular causes so coincided between religion and politics that that was how they were identified. And that led outsiders to often believe that the conflict was more religious than was actually the case. Because there were always people kind of in both communities, whatever their political aspiration, wanted an end to violence and wanted to have normal government restored.
Дякую, отче. І останнє запитання.
Thank you, Father. And the last question, because we will be moving on to the questions from the audience. We see hands raised. Thank you for your active participation. The next question of this current seminar. Dr. Mitchell, Father Thomas, how can we clearly understand the atrocities of that conflict and what collective risks and dangers can the society of the Northern Ireland face in this context?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, you go first.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the horrors of the conflict are, I mean, I know Northern Ireland is not a terrible conflict compared to many other places, but Northern Ireland has a small population, so the proportion of people affected was very high. So around 3,500 people died during the 30 years, and about 500,000 were affected or were victims. This is what people estimate. So people who died, were injured, were displaced, were traumatized. 500,000 people out of around 1.5 million people. So it was a very large proportion of society here that was affected, and nearly everybody knew somebody who was killed in the conflict. And those impacts are huge, and they are transgenerational. So trauma is passed down from one generation to another, and this is something that we're learning about. Northern Ireland has very high rates of mental health problems, very high use of prescription drugs. It had a very high suicide rate, certainly in the last 20 years, relative to other parts of Western Europe. So the impacts, yeah, are huge. And I think the risks to Northern Ireland are that we forget the horrors of the conflict. And perhaps some young people think that conflict was great, or that conflict is glamorous or exciting. And there are still young people who become involved in violence. Some of them will join some of the illegal paramilitaries, or they get involved in riots, things like that. And there is a danger that as time passes, we forget how bad the conflict was and how precious the peace is. People in Belfast in Northern Ireland are quite cynical. They're quite gloomy people sometimes, and they are not good at appreciating, the peaceful situation that we have. So we need to do more to reconcile. We need to do more to build relationships between Protestants and Catholics. And we need to somehow build better relationships despite the fact that politics might change in the future. So there may well be a united Ireland sometime in the future, and we need to be able to talk about that and deal with that without any threats of violence, of a return to conflict. So I think those are some of the problems. I think we also need to expand our understanding of peace. And I think that is happening. But peace is not just about Protestants and Catholics. It's about social justice. It's about the inclusion and equality of women, of ethnic minorities, of people of different sexual orientations. We have big problems with racism in Northern Ireland, which is something that it may be linked to the conflict, because during the conflict we did not have much immigration. And then during the peace process, we have people coming from around the world, and people here are they're not used to diversity. So there are many aspects of society that we need to keep working on, and have a full idea of peace.
Thank you, Father Thomas.
My first visit to Northern Ireland was in the late spring of 1966, when I was 8, 9 years of age. We had a day off school to celebrate the 1916 Rising, which is a very important part of the story of the independence of Southern Ireland. But my family used the day to come north to buy some Michelin tires in the town of Oba. And that evening we were having a meal in a hotel, and my father said to us, somewhat jokingly, "It's getting dark now, and when it's dark here, that's when the shooting starts." Because there had been troubles here between 1956 and 62, and there had been earlier troubles. But those troubles had ended 4 years previously. And when we went there as a family in 1966, our sense was the era of violence is a thing of the past. It's gone. It's not going to come back. There's a new prime minister here now, Captain O'Neill, and he's trying to bring in reforms and changes in the air. There's no way we're going back to the old days. 10 years later, as a first-year university student in Dublin, I visited Belfast for the first time. The troubles were at their height. Military patrols on the street, checkpoints, armed police everywhere. What really interested me was how I grew up knowing there had been trouble, and now there was peace. And then the violence came. And when the violence started in 1969, I was 11, 12, and I thought this won't go on for too long. This will be short-lived, and changes will come. The politicians will take certain initiatives, and that will end this phase. But the violence went on for 25 years. And what has always interested me was the way in which we got used to peace. And then when violence came, we kind of got used to that in a certain way too. And people used to talk about an acceptable level of violence so that ordinary life could go on. And what David says is true, that for most of us, we knew at least one person or one family affected by the Troubles, but we kind of got on with our everyday life. And I spent the summer of 1976 in Armagh City, in Belfast and in Ballycastle, and one just tried to get on with life as best one could. Now that the peace has come, my fear is that we will take the peace for granted and that we will forget the horrors of the Troubles. What was particularly, I think, horrifying about the Troubles was that the violence often took place in a public context in the way it happened previously. When there had been trouble in 1956, 62, normally it was a paramilitary group attacking members of the security forces. Normally it didn't involve civilians. Whereas when the Troubles started from 1969 onwards, one form of attack was a bomb in a public place. Sometimes a no warning bomb, or sometimes a bomb and the timing device went awry and it went off sooner than expected. So ordinary citizens found themselves caught up in the violence. Sometimes there would be a reprisal and there'd be an attack on a bar and a public house, and often they were identifiable as mainly Catholic, mainly Protestant. So it meant that lots of people found themselves caught up with the Troubles in a way that hadn't happened in the conflict kind of in earlier years. I remember talking with two friends in Limerick in the summer of 1995, just after the ceasefires had come and there was peace. And there was discussion about the number of police who had been killed in the Troubles. And I knew that about 300 police officers lost their lives. One of my friends said, no, Tom, you've got the figures wrong there. It could be nothing like that, just probably 80 or 100. Well, I went back and I checked and I was right. It was about 300. But what struck me was for my two friends kind of living down in Limerick, what happened to the 200 extra, the 220 extra casualties that they weren't aware of? And it struck me how people kind of living far away, kind of in the south, often didn't have an in-depth sense of the horrors that were going on. And shootings of police officers often had an impact kind of on the Protestant community. Often those officers were people who were very, very involved as elders in Presbyterian churches or serving on the select vestry in Anglican churches. They were prominent kind of in their own community. Growing up, there was a family who lived near us whose son had been killed on the last day of World War II. And I always felt so sorry for them. He almost made it to the end of the war, but he was killed on the last day. And I feel sorry for all those who lost their lives in the conflict and for all their loved ones and their relations. But when the peace comes, people can rejoice in the peace so much that there is a danger that those who have suffered are forgotten about. And I think that in the time in which we live now, there has to be particular care and support given to those who lost loved ones, those who suffered injuries. People need support, and society has to be willing to invest in their care. And I would include in that not just our authorities here in Northern Ireland, but also the authorities in London and the authorities in the South, that this is something that we all have a certain responsibility in relation to caring for those who suffered in the Troubles. David spoke about young people nowadays who don't have a memory of the Troubles, how they can romanticize and idealize that area. I remember about 20 years ago, I was involved in pastoral work in the parish in the east of the city, and people working in the parish told me that the young people sometimes said that they wished they had been alive in the time of the Troubles because those were exciting times and there were brave heroes around, and the times in which we live now are dull and uninteresting by contrast. So I think the horror of what happened can never be minimized. The pain kind of each person, of each family has to be honored. And we can't in any way airbrush that out of history or become forgetful about it. There has to be a real reverence, respect, compassion, sympathy towards those kind of who lost loved ones. And there can be no trivialization or minimization of the extent of the conflict. And as David was saying earlier, prior to the conflict, people often lived side by side. While there were some recognizable Catholic and Protestant areas, there were quite a number of mixed areas. And then the Troubles, that all changed because people felt at risk, because they felt need of protection. They ended up kind of living closer to each other. And that has started kind of patterns in how people recreate, patterns in employment. So as we live through a time of peace coming out of conflict, there's a lot of reconstruction that has to take place. And I think the basic thing, nobody has a monopoly on suffering. People from all traditions, from all sides suffered. There can't be a hierarchy of victims. All victims are precisely victims, and we have to honor their story, and we have to give space for that story to be told, and for the pain and loss of their loved ones to be recognized, to be acknowledged. I think it would be very wrong and not good for the future if somehow that wasn't attended to in a healthy and wise way.
Дякую, отче Томасе. Дорогі учасники
Father Thomas, dear participants of the seminar. We are highly appreciative of our presenters for meaningful speeches. And right now, we move to the last part of the seminar, where we will have the questions from our virtual auditorium. And first of all, we pass the floor to Father Itali Decko.
Yuri, turn on your microphone.
Перепрошую. Отже,
дорогі учасники, dear participants, we express our gratitude to our presenters who shared their speeches. And finally, we move to the final part of our seminar, which is the questions, and I pass the floor to Ivan Dacko, Father, who is the president of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies of the Ukrainian Catholic University. Father Ivan, I pass the floor to you.
I will speak in English, okay?
Okay.
I have questions to both of you, to Professor Mitchell and to Father Leyden. I took very carefully the notes, and I would say I have more or less various questions to both of you, and also questions regarding which were not mentioned. I think our listeners from Ukraine don't exactly know what Bloody Sunday was. When did it take place? What was the reason? How did it happen? And what were the consequences? Second, what did the British Army do wrong when it came, or when it was called, to Northern Ireland? Now a question which you didn't mention, because when I lived in England, I lived in the Greater Manchester area, a lot was spoken about the Reverend Ian Paisley, who was very, very, and once again, very anti-Catholic. I don't think our people in Ukraine know exactly what was Sinn Féin and what its role was. And the same I could say, what was the role of the Irish Republican Army, IRA? The reason why I am asking all these questions, and the list is not over, is that we try to make comparisons between what happened in Northern Ireland and what is happening in today's Ukraine. Of course, the British government is not the government of President Putin. Ukraine's population is much higher than the population of Northern Ireland. But I think it would be a good thing if you would explain. Second, what consisted, in what did the Anglo-Irish Agreement consist of? What were those conclusions? After Brexit, what is Northern Ireland still member of the European Union, or is it outside? You said quite a bit about the situation today, and what are the churches doing towards reconciliation, be it Protestant and be it the Catholic Church? Did they do anything about it, or did they just look, or did they even encourage violence? It was said, I think, by Professor Mitchell, that now that peace has come, how does this peace look like? How you also said that especially the poor areas, or the poorer Northern Irish, of the Northern Irish population, was still, I mean, would like to do, is still not satisfied with the situation. Well, what is the government doing to improve the material, the social situation, to create a sort of welfare society, to create, a land of prosperity? So these are my questions to both of you. Thank you. Hello?
Okay.
David,
Yep.
would you like to go first, David?
Yep. That's a lot of questions, but they're all good questions. So I'll try not to take up. I'll try to answer them fairly quickly in the way that I can. So maybe there'll be space for anyone else, but they're all good. Yeah, Bloody Sunday was a very famous and notorious incident in the Troubles. In 1972, there was a peaceful civil rights march in the city of Derry, or Londonderry, as unionists call it. Um, the British Army opened fire and killed 13 unarmed civilians. Um, and this became one of the most shocking incidents in the whole conflict. And there was a government investigation at the time, which said that the protesters were armed, but this made people very angry. They didn't believe it. And then in the 2000s, after the peace process, the British government held another inquiry into Bloody Sunday, and it concluded that the protesters were unarmed, and the British government apologized for Bloody Sunday. So it was a really a key moment. I mean, what was the role of the British Army? Well, this is linked. The British Army initially tried to keep this peace, but then they were attacked by different sides. They had to search people's houses. They had to have military curfews. They got involved in gun battles, and they became part of the conflict. And part of the problem was that the British Army, they were trained to think of Northern Ireland as a kind of uh, uh, unruly colony. They were going in to treat the natives with suspicion, and they did not really know how to police the situation properly. I think the army probably learned during the conflict how to treat the local population with more respect, so that they did not worsen the situation. But the British Army definitely did make the situation worse at key moments. Ian Paisley was a, yes, very fundamentalist Protestant preacher who was also a politician. And he, I think, personally made the situation worse. And he made unionists very fearful and made them more extreme and paranoid about the situation. He made them, he was kind of a Donald Trump, or a populist leader. He created a lot of fear, and this is how he maintained his support. However, in 2007, he changed, and he agreed to share power with Martin McGuinness of Sinn Féin. And Martin McGuinness was a former commander of the IRA. So this was two former enemies who came together and apparently became friends. So it is quite a miraculous change in Ian Paisley's career. Who was Sinn Féin? Well, Sinn Féin was the political part of the IRA, or it was linked to the IRA. And in the 1970s, the IRA was the most important, and Sinn Féin were less important. But in the 1990s, Irish Republicans decided to use both violence and politics. So the IRA continued with its violence, but Sinn Féin started to stand for election, and it gradually got more and more votes. And eventually, Irish Republicans decided that the political route was the best one. It was the best way to possibly get a united Ireland. And today, Sinn Féin is the largest party in Northern Ireland, which is amazing because Northern Ireland was designed to make sure that unionists were always in charge. And yet today, Sinn Féin is now the largest party, but it still has to share power with the Unionists. So they still have to work together. The Anglo-Irish Agreement was a deal between the UK and Ireland. And really, they said in the agreement, they said they wanted to cooperate to find a solution to the problems in Northern Ireland. And after that, they worked more hard together to try and come up with a solution that they both could agree on. That was really the key part of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. It was interesting because it was made without the Unionists' support. So it was the governments going over the local parties and trying to make a deal to try and change the situation. Brexit, Northern Ireland is not in the EU anymore because it left the EU along with the rest of the United Kingdom. But it is in certain parts of the EU because the UK and EU agreed a special deal for Northern Ireland so that we did not have to create a new border on the island of Ireland. But in general, we are not in the EU, even though a majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to stay in the EU. Now, another thing which is interesting is that the Good Friday Agreement allows people to be Irish, British, or both. So we can have two passports here, an Irish passport and a British passport. So Unionists usually have British passports, Nationalists usually have Irish passports, and then many people have two passports. So before Brexit, I had a British passport, but after Brexit, I got an Irish passport as well. And then I had two passports, but then my British passport ran out. So now I just have an Irish passport. So I have gone from being British to British Irish to being Irish in the last few years. So that is an interesting situation. And many people want to have Irish passports because it is an EU passport. So even Unionists want to have an Irish passport now. And maybe I've said enough. Maybe Father Tom could talk about the churches, perhaps, and what they have done.
As I was saying earlier on, the churches realized that they were part of the problem too, because we are part of society here. The churches, I think, were always united in their belief and conviction that politics should be progressed in a peaceful way. The churches were always opposed to violence. And opposed to violence, not just from paramilitaries, but the churches also expected the state to work within the law. And there was a document that came out in the 1970s called Violence in Ireland, a kind of an inter-church document. Cathal Daly and Stanley Worrell were involved in it. And they were clear that all were called to do things in a peaceful way. People with a political cause, but also kind of the agents of the state. In the troubled years, people used to sometimes say that the clergy in the church were tribal chaplains, that they were chaplains to their own tribe. And I was very helped by a friend of mine who said to me once that he felt that was simplistic and a bit condescending and disrespectful. He said, actually, the clergy have remained close to their people in the way they had to do that. As shepherds, they have to walk with the people alongside them. They can't be distant. They can't be far away. But the clergy also, I think, were able to have an influence because their first commitment was to the gospel and to the faith of the church. They often were seen as people without vested interests. They were seen as neutral in some ways, and often both paramilitaries and the state trusted them, felt that they could be honest brokers. And there were people like Father Alec Reid, for example, a Redemptorist from Clonard here in Belfast, who had discreet contacts with the Republican movement, was known to them, was trusted by them, and played a key part in discussions between the Republican movement, Sinn Féin, and the Dublin government, which gave rise to the negotiations out of which came the Belfast Agreement of Good Friday 1998. On the Protestant side, I think of somebody like the Reverend Roy McGee, kind of a Presbyterian minister who was respected by the loyalist paramilitaries and who played a role in the background in terms of the ceasefire that they announced in October 1994. And particularly, they're taking responsibility for their actions and speaking about abject remorse, as Gusty Spence did at a press conference. I think because the churches kind of stayed with the people in the area, they had a credibility at local level, but also they had a credibility with people in other parts of the community and a credibility with those who had responsibility for government. A few weeks ago, I was at a meeting up in Corrymeela, which is a reconciliation centre up on the north coast here in Northern Ireland, set up by a Presbyterian minister back in the 1960s. It was set up to be a place for international students of Christian background to meet. But in the years of the Troubles, it became a safe space for everyone to meet. And there were many clergy of all traditions kind of involved in that. I think of Harold Good, who was the director of Corrymeela when I spent time there when I was a university student, and who was also involved in witnessing the decommissioning of IRA arms with Father Reid back in the summer of 2005. So I think the churches kind of did play a role because they were close to their people and because they had credibility. But like everybody else, the churches, I think, had to learn, and we had to learn that we're part of the problem. And like, in a sense, everybody wanted peace during the Troubles. It's a bit like everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. Everybody wanted peace. But I sometimes wonder, for peace to come, we'll all have to make sacrifices. We can't have everything we want. We can't have Northern Ireland, both in the UK and in the Republic, in a way there'll have to be some give and take. And I think in the churches, we had to learn kind of over the years, and I've been quite involved in interchurch marriage and supporting people kind of in an interchurch background, coming from different traditions. And I would say that maybe in an earlier time, there was a tendency for the clergy to kind of to tell people what to do, rather than to accompany people as they discern the best way of going forward in terms of their own church going on Sundays and how they pass on the faith to their children. People involved in ministry in the church would always say that they learn more from the people they serve than they ever teach them. And I think the churches in the troubled years in Northern Ireland, I think by walking with the people, they heard their pain, whether it was the people who had suffered on Bloody Sunday or the people who had suffered on Bloody Friday in the same year when bombs went off kind of here in the centre of Belfast at several locations. Down through the years, it was the churches that had to be with the people when their loved ones were shot. It was the churches that had to look after the funeral services. And I would say by and large, the churches always tried to do the funeral services in a respectful way and to refrain from any kind of intemperate language. There would often be pressure on the churches to engage in condemnation. And I think the churches would condemn actions, but not condemn people, because in a way, it's only God can judge people. And if you condemn people, you preclude the possibility that they will engage in conversation with you, that they will change, that they will open up to new ways and to new vistas. There's always the temptation for the church to become part of the establishment. And we know that on certain occasions, the state would like to have a ceremony in the church, would like to have the clergy there to say prayers. And there can be a very good side to that, because we are part of the broader society. But we have to make sure that we don't lose our neutrality, that our first commitment is to the gospel rather than to the state or to any kind of political view. And coming out of the gospel, there are challenges in terms of social justice, in terms of equality, in terms of kind of reaching out to the marginalized, that we in the churches have to always push to the states, to political parties, to the wider society. We can't be too comfortable. We can't be too cozy. I'd say there was always that temptation. Maybe there were times we ended up being a little bit too comfortable, a little bit too cozy. But I think as the years went by, the deeper desire was to be closer to the people and to speak a word of truth that would liberate, that we heard from listening to our conversations with the people.
Дякую вам, отче Томасе. Дорогі
Thank you,
учасники,
Father
у нас
Thomas,
залишається
dear
10 хвилин
participants.
нашого
We've got
семінару.
10 minutes left of
Маємо ще
our
час
seminar,
на одне
and
запитання.
we've got
Пані
still
Надія,
some time
здається,
for one
ви
question.
піднімали
Nadia,
руку
I
свою.
think that
Я попрошу
you
вас,
have
пані
raised your
Надія,
hand.
представитися, а також
So, Nadia,
задати питання, назвати, кому ви хочете
please
адресувати своє
ask a
запитання.
question and
Дякую,
tell
прошу.
for whom this question is.
Good evening. Hello. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if I can switch on my camera. Anyone knows, or the host disabled this? Yeah, okay. So great. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, hi there. Hello
Hi
from
there.
you. Yeah, I'm in the cafe, so I do hope that the background music is still fine and you can hear me well. First of all, thank you very much for the very insightful talk. And I'm extremely interested in the subject because I do my PhD in Irish studies here at Lviv University. And it's not actually on the political aspect, but still I do this in linguistics. But I think when it comes to, well, generally the language question, even politics is also involved. So that's actually that's why I'm interested in everything, yeah, in linguistics, but at the same time in social, economic, and political aspects of the Republic and Northern Ireland. I have really a lot of questions, but I probably would ask only one or two. But yeah, if you, well, Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Layden, if you have an opportunity, I would really like to reach out to you after the seminar and maybe still schedule a short call for like 10-15 minutes and talk to you more about this, of course, if you have time and opportunity to do this. So the question is concerns the terminology. The word, the troubles itself. Well, the question refers to anyone, whoever feels like answering. So would you think that the word itself, the troubles, is a little bit euphemistic, that it doesn't really say like violent conflict, the war, because it is, I think, well, in a way, right? Maybe not the full-scale war we experience in Ukraine these days, but still. So wouldn't you think it's a bit euphemistic? What you just generally think about this? And yeah, and also there was a question, well, as of now, I'm interviewing Irish people, both from Ulster and the Republic, and this is a social linguistic analysis, and I often ask them different questions about the use of Irish and, well, generally what they think about the situation. I do not actually talk about politics, because every time I ask questions, people, they don't want to answer these questions, and I feel that yeah, I'm just a stranger from the internet who's reached out to them and wants to ask some questions. So maybe you can advise me on how to talk to the Irish people about some delicate subjects, like what they think about, well, are they unionists or not? Do you really talk about these questions, or is it a taboo thing? I mean, you probably know if your friends want to join the Republic or not, or maybe you don't know about this. Do you speak about this with your friends? Would you normally ask this question to a stranger, or would you stay silent? So pardon me if I ask you something very inappropriate. I'm just an outsider and I really don't know how to talk to people about this. So thank you very much, and pardon me once again any yeah, inappropriate questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm inclined to agree with you about the troubles being a euphemism, and remember thinking that myself back about 1976, 77. I thought it was a way in which we downplayed the gravity of the violence and the great impact it was having. In those years, I was living mainly in the South, and I was an occasional visitor up here. And what I would have noticed was that among many people in the South, there was a lack of interest in Northern Ireland. There was a sense, well, there are very complex problems there, and they go on, and maybe they'll never be solved. And unless people had family living here, or unless they had a business interest here, they really didn't want to know. But whenever something really big happened, then people weren't quite so neutral. Then they were engaged. And there were one or two moments when it looked as if the violence was going to spill over into the Republic, like there were some bombs in Dublin in 1972, 73, and a major one in 1974. And at that stage, people said, gosh, there are issues here that we need to look at. I think the reason it wasn't referred to as a war was because the London government and the Dublin government didn't see it as a war. They felt a war would be declared by a state, by a sovereign state, and they didn't see the IRA or the UVF as a sovereign state or as official armies. So they didn't use the word war, didn't want to use the word war. Whereas I know some paramilitaries did want to use the word war, and I know some former paramilitaries who will speak about the war rather than the troubles. So I think there was a technical and a political reason. And also, of course, the paramilitaries would have seen themselves as soldiers, whereas the governments would have seen them as terrorists, as people who were kind of creating terror and kind of operating outside of normal parliamentary democracy, because the democracy army takes its orders from the government, and the government kind of is elected by the people. So I suppose a certain ideology kind of enters in. I feel maybe the years of violence, the one has to maybe go for something a little more serious than troubles, and maybe not quite war, even though some people did experience it as being living in an actual war situation. I sometimes felt that in cities like Belfast and Derry, Londonderry, and other towns in Northern Ireland, it was almost a bit like what I imagine it was like living in London during the Blitz, and people putting up signs saying business as usual. They wanted ordinary life to go on. They didn't want the violence kind of to stop kind of ordinary life. In terms of talking about Northern Ireland and how I would do it, generally speaking, if I don't know people very well, I'm careful about what I want to say, because I wouldn't want to cause offense. A unionist is entitled to be British and to want here to remain in the United Kingdom. A nationalist is entitled to be Irish and to want here kind of to be in the Irish Republic. When I know people a bit better, I feel there's an openness. I might say something like, well, are there different models we could have for Northern Ireland going into the future? Is there any way in which these different national aspirations can be brought together? It seems that we have power sharing now. I think that with people in the South, it's probably no harm for an outsider like yourself, maybe to challenge their disengagement. Some people in the South are beginning to say, if there were a united Ireland, it would be expensive for us. We wouldn't be able to afford to pay for the education and health services they have up there, even though we here know that there are problems with our education and health, and it's not all plain sailing. But many people in the South are worried about the economic cost of a united Ireland. There's a politician down south, and I often find the phrase he uses very helpful. He doesn't speak about a united Ireland, he speaks about a shared island. No matter what happens constitutionally, here might remain part of the United Kingdom, the Republic might remain separate, but we share this island together. How can we work together in those areas of common concern, like we do in tourism at the moment? There's good cooperation between the tourist authorities here in Northern Ireland and their counterparts in the South. And there are areas like agriculture. At the time of the foot and mouth disease some years ago, all the farmers were making kind of common cause kind of with each other because they felt their industry was under threat. I think we can only expect people to be free to speak about the future of Northern Ireland where they feel safe and where they feel it's comfortable and they're going to be respected and heard and not put under pressure. But I think all of us have to have some thoughts about the status quo, about its strengths, its weaknesses, and about how things might be in the future. But I'm sure David also would have angles on these questions.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm interested in your research topic and what you're looking at. And if you want to contact me, I have done some research myself on the politics of language in the North. As well as how some people are using it to promote reconciliation, actually using the Irish language to promote reconciliation. But the politics of language in Ireland is fascinating. So yeah, the Troubles, it is a euphemism, but it is quite acceptable across society, and that's why we use it. Republicans, as Father Tom says, Republicans call it a war. Unionists say it was a terrorist campaign. So the Troubles is kind of an acceptable term that most people can use to refer to that period. And I think it originated in an earlier period because in the 1920s, people talked about the Troubles at that time, and then the term came back. I am surprised if people are not willing to talk to you or not willing to be open to you, because usually people in Ireland, certainly people in Northern Ireland, they are suspicious of each other, but they are very friendly and open with people from other countries. So
Especially in
usually
pubs, especially in pubs.
in pubs, yeah. I mean, most of my students are American, and they have no problems. People will talk to them about their whole life story, but local people are a little bit nervous around each other because they do not want to reveal their identity or they do not want to cause offense, so they tiptoe around each other. So but it's still a sensitive topic to and yes, it's not normal to ask anyone their background or how they would vote in an Irish unity referendum. That's a bit sensitive, but because I work in politics, in teaching about politics, I just ask people things and people ask me things. But in normal life, it is quite sensitive, I think.
Дякую. І останнє запитання нашого семінару хоче
And finally, the last
задати
question of our
Михайло
seminar
Фабрігас, який є
by
директором Інституту екуменічних студій
the
Українського
director of the
католицького
Institute of
університету. Отже, Романе, будь
Ecumenical
ласка.
Studies,
Thank you very much.
Father Roman.
Dr. David Mitchell and Dr. Reverend Leiden. It was for the clear and understandable presentation of the origin, progress, and hopefully the finish of the conflicts which happened in the Northern Ireland. What was interesting is that for me as a scientist, which is investigating the question of the Christian unity, that as for me, the religion was instrumentalized in the conflict. Yes, so Catholics, Protestants, and it was mixed with the political claims and made many troubles. It is interesting that in Ukraine we also have such a religious dimension of the war. And for example, when the Putin went against Ukraine, is also one part of his propaganda was to liberate Ukraine from and to make here the Holy Rus, the territory, yes, of one holy church, so-called. For me, the experience of the Northern Ireland would be, I think, very useful for for Ukraine after the war, when the war finished. Why? Because our societies will be, I think, divided who took part in the war, who defeated our land, who suffered a lot, and who just maybe someone who cooperated, especially in the occupied territories. So I think this experience of the Northern Ireland would be very helpful when the war will finish, hopefully in Ukraine, of this Russian aggression. Yes, but what I'm curious to hear from you. What are the safeguards against the aggression now, which we have in the Northern Ireland? Maybe 2 or 3, which are very useful to stop this aggression. What are the safeguards against it and against the instrumentalization of religion as well? Thank you.
Well, I think if you mean safeguards against violence happening again, there are a number of things. One is political inclusion. So all the parties have access to the government, and so they cannot complain that they are being excluded from government. They have to have the responsibility of running things. A second thing is human rights and equality. So we have strong human rights laws, and people must be treated equally. And so there are not the kind of grievances today that people had in the past. And then hopefully, I think we need to do a lot of education as well. Like we have been saying, people need to understand the conflict, the violence, how bad it was. And hopefully, if we can continue to educate, um, that will help people. I mean, I don't know if, do you know the TV program Derry Girls? Have you heard of Derry Girls? It's on Netflix. It's very famous around the world. It's about people living during the Troubles, and I think it is trying to educate younger people about the peace agreement and how important the peace agreement was. So I think through all these measures, we can try and prevent the kind of grievance happening, and we can promote a kind of culture of dialogue, and we need to delegitimize, violence as a political pathway. So
I think one safeguard that can be there against aggression is to make sure that we remember the past in the way that's good, that we recall the past in a wholesome way, that somehow the story of the past is kept alive, not in the way that we're trapped in the past, but that we can respect our sisters and brothers in the human family at that moment in our history, and we can learn from their experience. I would agree with David. I think that what mainly helps keep the peace here is when our institutions of government work, when our assembly meets, when our representatives kind of debate, and when they make laws, and when the executive does its job, running the various government departments, making decisions that impact on education, health, social services, justice. For many years, there was direct rule from Westminster from 1972 up to kind of when the Good Friday Agreement kind of came into operation after 1998 and the early 2000s. But for people here, they weren't directly involved in governance kind of in their own area, in their own community. And I think it's been very empowering for people to have their own locally represented members now actually occupying the ministries. People won't always agree with decisions made at local level, but there's a sense this is being done by people from here now. It's not being done by somebody from London. It's being done by one of our own. And sometimes it might be from the party that I support. Other times it might be a person from another party. There's something shared, and that's the way it has to be if here is to be an inclusive kind of place going forward. There is an event that takes place in Belfast every year called the Four Corners Festival in January. It's set up by Presbyterian minister Steve Stockman and the Catholic priest Martin McGill. And it came out of the awareness that each of them had that each of us knows one of the four corners of Belfast, north, south, east, west, but often we don't know the other corners. I think anything we do that brings people together from different parts of the city, like I'm on a committee that represents those who are involved in the care of older buildings in this part of North Belfast, and that meets about once a month. But at that meeting, I meet people from other parts of the community, people who are kind of associated with groups that would be very, very different to the Catholic Church, and I get to know them. I meet them once a month, and like when a special day was coming up for one of them on the 12th of July during the summer, I sent him an email on the 11th and I said, well, I hope the weather is good tomorrow and that it doesn't rain. Those little things where we kind of take the trouble to learn about each other and to respect each other's traditions, that can help safeguard against the return. But I think the main thing is just the memory of how awful it was and of how it diminished us and how it held up growth here for many years. But the Four Corners Festival, I think, reminds us that there's a lot of work to be done, that the peace just doesn't arrive. The peace has to be progressed, it has to be maintained, we have to work at it. And it's not just the absence of violence, it's the presence of mutual respect. It's allowing kind of each person, each tradition to have their place and to feel safe in the wider society.
Correct.
Дуже дякую вам, отче Томасе. Дорогі учасники, наш час
Thank you, Father Thomas. Dear participants, our time is up. I really appreciate that all of our participants who have opened things we could not think about. A lot of food for consideration. Thank you to the participants, and thank you as well to the interpreters who have carried out really efficient and professional job. Thank you so much. Hopefully we will see once again at certain seminars arranged by our institute or university or any other organization. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much. Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.